for proposals. The governor releasing her executive budget proposal outlining how she would want to pay for the legislative priorities. Hear from our expert panel on what might take priority in the state spending plan. Hello and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. This week, Governor Kathy Hochul laying out her executive budget for fiscal year 2025. The proposed budget landing at $233 billion. The budget increasing by nearly $6 billion. It includes $35 billion for education funding, $115 million to reduce retail theft and domestic violence, and $500 million to build 15,000 housing units on state-owned property. The proposal not finding universal approval. Republicans are not happy with migrant spending, and members of the governor's own party are giving conditions on passing housing.
As I've said to everyone, I've said it to all of you, and I'll say it again. We want a housing deal. There's got to be something in it for developers and tenants and labor alike for the Assembly to agree.
I'm joined now by an expert panel to break down the executive budget. First, we have Blair Horner, the executive director from the New York Public Interest Research Group, and we have Patrick Orecki, the director of state studies at Citizens Budget Commission. Guys, welcome to the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
So first and foremost, the governor unveiled her $233 billion state budget. Was anything surprising to you in that budget?
Yeah, I think to the extent there were surprises, it was generally good news. I mean, the state entered budget making this year with a $4.3 billion gap for the coming fiscal year, was able to close that in part with a lot of kind of increased revenues. The economy is doing better than we'd projected for the last year, so that's great. It helps close a lot of that gap. And then also some savings actions really across the board. So the budget that was proposed by the governor is balanced as required, which is great.
I just add, I agree with Patrick that the governor's proposal benefited from the fact that the state's going to end up, it looks like, with a couple of $1 billion plus surplus this year, which goes a long way toward dealing with the budget deficit. But it also felt like, in many ways not surprising, was a typical governor's budget, where she comes in lower for the legislature to backfill the numbers back in. Some of the, I think, the limits on spending on Medicaid and K-12 are going to run into some steep opposition in the legislature, particularly from the powerful unions, 1199 for healthcare and NYSUT for K-12 education. And so how that all plays out, I think, is how the legislative session will play out in terms of the budget.
And I was going to ask you, what do you think is going to be the most controversial issue of this whole budget?
Well, just to piggyback on what I was just saying, I think it's going to be, in terms of the fight of the, sort of the elephants in the budget process, it's going to be the K-12 Medicaid side of it, I think, because those are significant reductions. My understanding is what the governor's doing, for example, in Medicaid is about $3 billion less than they expect to spend. So where's that going to come from? And so I think the debate over health care and education will be they're always 1 and 2 in terms of where the state spends money, and it wouldn't surprise me if they're 1 and 2 in terms of the fight.
And I know that there's a $2.4 billion plan for the migrant crisis. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I think that might have been another surprise, frankly, just how much money was added there. So the state had already had $1.9 billion in the financial plan over 2 years, which is a big chunk of change. So adding $2.4 billion to that is a huge amount of money. It does offer a big relief valve for New York City, which is good. Also did their budget update on the same day. So I think that's good news for both the state and the city. Kind of the concern there, though, is that this is a fiscal issue that's having a longer tail than we originally kind of expected, and it's also bigger in volume than we originally expected. So this is something that we're going to have to keep paying very close attention to for probably years.
And in the weeks and months going forward, what do you think the plan will be by the legislature?
Well, I think they're going to be looking to restore spending that the powerful groups care about. But where they come up with the revenues will be the tricky part of the whole thing. Will the economy continue to improve? Everybody was expecting a recession, and so budgets were built around those expectations. It's obviously the revenues are better than they expected. Will they be better still over the next few months? The state has to project those things because tax day is April 15th, and the budget is supposed to be done, of course, appropriately, April Fool's Day, April 1st. I think those two will be big ticket items. And there's a lot of other issues, though, where the state really, we would argue, is going to need to start spending more money. For example, in the area of climate resilience, and the governor talks a lot about that in the budget, but the spending is in the M category, millions, not the B category, billions, which is what I think the state is going to start expecting to see with more intense storms, rising sea levels, more intense heat, and as we saw last spring, orange-colored air from pollution of wildfires in Canada. Those kinds of problems aren't going away anytime soon. Similar to the migrant issue, which as far as we can tell isn't going to change anytime in the near future, climate change is going to continue to be a problem for years and years to come.
And I know one of the themes in the State of the State was affordability and housing. Do you think that the legislature will come to an agreement on that?
I think that is probably one of the, after the top line kind of spending figures and some of the savings areas, housing is again going to be pretty fraught. And it's really, really tricky because we're in this space where it's tough to deal with it in a massive way within the budget because everything else is also on the table. But once you move post-budget into the other part of session 2, the legislature's really emphasized that there should be dollars to encourage housing production, which you can't do post-budget. So some of the things we saw the governor put on the table don't have a direct state fiscal impact. They're tax credits for production in the city, things like that. So could see that move out and go post-session or post-budget too.
And I know budget hearings are coming up starting next week. Anything you think the public needs to be aware of?
Well, this is the opportunity for the public to sort of pay attention to what's being discussed. I mean, we're talking about it for 10 minutes today. The budget is a $233 billion plan by the governor, which the legislature may add to. Where you get under the hood is during the budget hearing process, and those run basically starting next week until President's Week, and that's the opportunity for the public to sort of tune in and see how their money is being proposed to be spent.
So in the weeks and days and months ahead, we'll be definitely keeping an eye on things. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And changes could be on the way for schools across the state. When we return, we'll hear from the State School Board Association on what the governor's executive budget could mean for smaller districts. If you have a comment or a story idea, let us know. You can email us at news@news10.com. You can also reach out on X, formerly known as Twitter, at WTEN. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. As a part of the executive budget, Governor Hochul is proposing changes that could see some schools possibly getting less state aid. The changes are aimed at decreasing foundation aid by over $400 million. This coming after foundation aid was fully funded last year. Districts use the funding awarded to them from foundation aid to cover costs. The change could decrease aid to schools that showed a decrease in enrollment. The governor explaining the reasoning for this proposed change.
Populations have shifted, and some districts that may not have been high need before are higher need. I want to make sure I have the flexibility to take care of our high need school districts.
Joining me now to give additional insight on the governor's proposed changes to education spending is Brian Fessler with the New York State School Board Association. Brian, it's so good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So when it comes to education funding in the state budget, $35 billion has been set aside, $825 million increase from last year. Do you think that this is enough?
So I'll say, frankly, we were somewhat surprised and disappointed with the overall aid package. And I think that's especially in comparison to the great progress that we've made over the past few years. With school aid in particular, we finally, in the current school year, achieved full funding of foundation aid. We were hopeful that would continue going into 2024 or 24-25. The governor's package pulls back on that full funding progress to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So somewhat surprised, and I think, frankly, somewhat disappointed with the package that we saw from the governor's budget proposal last week.
And for viewers who may not know, what is foundation aid?
So foundation aid, one, it's the largest school aid category, but at its most basic level, it's operational aid for school districts. So flexible dollars to allow districts to meet their basic obligations to educate students, to support their district, to really run the schools. It's the largest aid category. It's operating aid for schools.
And the governor is proposing changes to the equation, right, of how that money gets distributed. Can you talk a little bit about that equation and why this is so concerning for some school organizations?
Sure, that's a good question. Without boring your listeners too much, getting under the hood a little bit, the governor's proposing to reduce the inflationary factor that factors into the formula from nearly 4%, kind of what we've seen over the past year or so, to a number closer to 2%. That suppresses the aid figures for all districts statewide. The other big change, importantly, there's a kind of a school funding principle called save harmless or hold harmless that says for foundation aid in particular, school districts would not receive less than they did in the previous year. So may not see an increase as much as all districts would like, but at a minimum, kind of holding those districts harmless. The governor's proposing to pull back on that decades-long standing principle. So we see north of 300 districts across the state, or more than half, would see a year-over-year reduction or decline or cut in foundation aid.
And there's been some concern about rural school districts, right? That this could harm them in some ways?
Yeah, I think that's that's a reflection of the numbers that we see in the budget. The governor and the director of budget noted that they're looking at districts that have seen enrollment loss or decline over the past couple decades. That has tended to be districts in more rural areas of the state. Not exclusively, that applies to other districts really across the state as well. But we do see when we take a look at the numbers and the details in the budget that a lot of those reductions tend to be in some of our smaller, more rural districts that have seen some enrollment loss in recent years. Our perspective and our push is that this isn't simply about numbers. For nearly all districts, student need, whether academic, social, emotional, has increased at a greater rate than what some districts are seeing in overall enrollment decline.
And I know the governor also proposed going back to basics when it comes to reading. Can you talk a little bit about that for people who may have never heard about this before?
Yeah, the governor, as part of her State of the State address, noted this back to basics kind of literacy reading instruction proposal. We've taken a look at it. Obviously, we're on board with the governor when she cites the importance of making sure all of our students know how to read. That's one of the most basic, goals of a school district in preparing our students for high school and then life after high school. So we agree and we support the governor's focus on that. We always want to make sure that, the state is striking the balance between, their relationship with individual school districts. As the School Boards Association, we always believe that those instructional decisions and classroom decisions are best made locally with appropriate input and guidance from experts at the state education department. So we're supportive of the governor's overall goal and look forward to working with her to make sure that the path forward to get to that point is something that we think makes sense and is appropriate for all of our school districts.
And how big of an impact did the pandemic have on children's ability to learn and their reading scores?
Yeah, I think that varies for students, across districts and across the state. Obviously, the impact from the pandemic on our students was across the board, whether instructional, student mental health, and we're still seeing those challenges for plenty of students in trying to make sure that they are either caught up or kind of continuing to progress down the path of their educational career. And so that's, as we take a look at the governor's, school aid package from her budget, we want to make sure the resources are there to continue that progress that so many school districts have made, as we've pulled out of the pandemic and helped our students, kind of achieve at the level that we expect and they deserve. And so we want to make sure the resources in the budget each year kind of match those obligations and those needs for all of our students in all situations in all districts.
Well, Brian Fessler, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
You too. and making mental health care accessible for everyone. When we return, what action state leaders are taking against insurance companies to get New Yorkers the support they need. If you have a comment or story idea, let us know. You can email us at news@news10.com. You can also reach out on X, formerly known as Twitter, at WTEN. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. One of Governor Kathy Hochul's top priorities for this year is to focus on the issue of mental health. I spoke with New York's Attorney General about her office's investigation into accessing mental health care through insurance companies. Governor Kathy Hochul recently announced proposals to support mental health treatment. She wants to make sure New Yorkers are getting the help they need through their insurance companies.
One would say, well, I have insurance. Isn't that supposed to cover everything? Guess what? They have not been doing this. Insurance companies, and many are doing the right thing, and there are others who are not.
A report released last month by the New York Attorney General's office found a majority of insurance companies had wrong information in their mental health provider directories. Attorney General Letitia James explains.
The numbers were incorrect. They did not provide service. They only provided service that was virtual. They did not provide pediatric service, geriatric service. They could not be reached. They were no longer accepting new patients, or they did not even exist.
James says those who need help should be able to get immediate assistance. To fix this problem, her office released recommendations to insurance companies.
That their lists be up to date, that they also create more incentives for providers to join their networks. Individuals should not have to go out of network and pay out of pocket for these services.
The president of the New York Health Plan Association says health plans work hard to ensure their directories are up to date and accurate, adding, quote, "Our industry remains committed to working with the Attorney General, the Hochul administration, and legislative leaders on policy solutions to increase access and ensure patients get the mental health care services, care, and support they need."
No New Yorker should be deprived of care because insurance companies won't cover it.
We're now awaiting the verdict in the civil fraud trial against former President Donald Trump. Lawyers giving their closing arguments last week in a trial that the former president has turned into something of a campaign stop. Our correspondent Henry Rossoff explains.
It's a very unfair trial. Nobody's seen anything like this.
Lamenting the fact that the judge had initially said he would not be allowed to make a closing statement in his own civil fraud trial, former President Donald Trump settled into his courtroom seat to listen. His attorneys made the argument that Attorney General Letitia James and her team did not make the case. Trump is accused of inflating various values of his properties to rip off banks and insurance companies. His legal team says there's no coordinated conspiracy, nobody was harmed, and the allegations are outside the statute of limitations anyway. Judge Arthur Engoron often interjected, seeming skeptical. He's already found the former president liable for the top-line charge of fraud before the trial even started. But just before lunch, the judge did allow Trump to make a statement, warning him to stick to the financial facts of the case. It's a warning the former president largely ignored. He said, quote, "We have a situation where I'm an innocent man and I'm being persecuted. This is not consumer fraud. This is not fraud. This is a fraud on me." Then he turned his attention to Attorney General James, quote, "The person in the room right now hates Trump and is using Trump to get elected." It closely mirrored his comments outside the courtroom, where he continues to claim, without evidence, this case and several criminal cases he's facing this coming year are a coordinated conspiracy.
These are all set up. Every time somebody sees me in court, remember, Joe Biden and his thugs that surround him did it.
But at stake here is not Trump's freedom nor political prospects, but his wealth. The Attorney General is asking the judge to impose a more than $300 million fine and to bar him and his family from doing business in New York ever again.
Stick around and we'll be back for a look at the week ahead in just a bit. If you have a comment or story idea, let us know. You can email us at news@news10.com. You can also reach out on X, formerly known as Twitter, at WTEN. Currently in Empire State Weekly, patient advocates are hoping to get medical aid in dying legislation signed into law this session. The bill would allow terminally ill adults with 6 months or less to live to request and self-administer medication to die. Supporters say this would allow terminally ill patients to avoid a lower quality of life that comes with prolonged illness. Opponents argue there are not enough restrictions in place to keep vulnerable populations safe.
We are concerned that if it is legalized, that any sort of restrictions currently in place won't be in place for long. And realistically, the tracking mechanisms just aren't there. What we would like to see really is, an increase in palliative care and hospice, increase in home-based services.
10 other states and Washington, D.C. have already passed similar legislation. We'll be sure to keep an eye on this and bring you any developments as we learn more. For now, from all of us here in Empire State Weekly, I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. We'll see you back here next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here's the full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across New York.